Good morning, everybody. This is Denise Tawwab coming back to you again with a video on NIST Special Publication 839, Managing Information Security Risk. In this video, we're going to be looking at step 2 of the risk management process, the risk assessment step. Keep in mind the risk management process consists of framing risk, assessing risk, responding to risk, and monitoring risk. In an earlier video, I discussed risk framing, and so now we're going to get into step 2, risk assessment. What we will cover, we'll do an overview of the process. We'll talk about risk assessments. We'll discuss inputs and preconditions to this step. And then we'll talk about the 2 risk assessment activities, which are threat and vulnerability identification and risk determination. And finally, we'll talk about the outputs of the risk assessment step and post conditions. So the overview of the process. Each of the steps in the risk management process is described in a structured manner, focusing on inputs and preconditions necessary to initiate the step, the specific activities or tasks that compose the step, and finally, the outputs that result from the step. The effects of the risk concepts described in Chapter 2, Tolerance, Trust, and Culture, are also discussed in the context of the risk management process and its multi-tiered approach. Remember, risk management happens at 3 tiers: the organization level, the mission business process level, so those are your business processes, and then the system level. And most people do information security management, risk management at the system level. Okay, here's a graphic that looks at what we're doing in the risk management process. Framing, of course, is the central activity, and then assess, respond, and monitor. Now, this comes from, no, I'm not going to go into that right now. All right, about risk assessments. Let's talk. What is a risk assessment? Risk assessment identifies, prioritizes, and estimates the risk to your organization's operations, your organization's assets, individuals, other organizations, and for some organizations, and especially federal agencies, the nation. The risks that result from the operation and use of information systems. So let's say this again. What is a risk assessment? A risk assessment identifies, prioritizes, and estimates risk to organizational operations. For example, your mission, your functions, your image, your reputation, your organization's assets, to individuals, to other organizations that you might interact with, and the nation, resulting from the operation and use of information systems. Risk assessments use the results of threat and vulnerability assessments to identify and evaluate risk in terms of likelihood of occurrence and potential adverse impact to your organization, assets, and individuals, the magnitude of harm. So, a risk assessment identifies, prioritizes, and estimates risk to your organizational operations, your organizational assets, your individuals, other organizations, and the nation, resulting from the operation and use of information systems. So I've said that for the 3rd time, so I hope we all are clear on what a risk assessment is. Now, your risk assessment considerations. What happens on each risk management tier? Risk management can be conducted at any of the risk management tiers, and each tier has different objectives and uses for the information provided. So tier 1, risk assessment considerations. Risk assessments that are conducted at tier 1 or tier 2 focus on organizational operations, assets, and individuals, whether comprehensive across business lines or only on those assessments that are cross-cutting to a particular business line. Organization-wide assessments of risk can be based solely on the assumptions, constraints, risk tolerances, priorities, and trade-offs established in the risk framing step. And again, if you haven't listened to that video, I would suggest that you do so before continuing this one. And all of those things are derived primarily from tier 1 activities or Organization-wide risk assessments can be based on risk assessments that are conducted across multiple business lines and derived primarily from Tier 2 activities, and that's your mission business process level. The organization-wide risk assessments provide some initial prioritization of risk for your decision makers to consider when entering the risk response step. So risk assessments can happen at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. Risk assessments conducted at one tier can be used to refine and enhance your threat, vulnerability, likelihood, and impact information used in assessments conducted at other tiers. For example, I can do a high level risk assessment, but then when I have one of my business lines do a risk assessment at the business level, they may discover some information that I haven't considered because I'm not working at that tier, and they can pass that information up to Tier 1, and that becomes an input into the Tier 1 risk assessment. Does that make sense? The degree that information from risk assessments can be reused is shaped by the similarity in the mission business functions and also by the degree of autonomy that organizational entities or subcomponents have with respect to the parent organization. Organizations that are decentralized can conduct more risk assessment activities at Tier 2 at the business level, and as a result, may have a greater need to communicate within Tier 2 to identify cross cutting threats and vulnerabilities. Decentralized organizations can still benefit from the identification of an initial set of threat and vulnerability sources at Tier 1 in Tier 1 risk assessments. So I can start at Tier 1 with a high level and then pass that down to the different business units. And those business units can add the business unit information and refine the risk assessment. Maintaining risk assessments, because they're living documents. Once risk assessments are completed, your organization must keep the assessments current. Maintaining the currency of risk assessments requires support from the risk monitoring step. For example, observing changes in your information systems and the environments of operation, or analyzing monitoring results to maintain awareness of the risk. Keeping risk assessments up to date will provide many potential benefits, such as timely, relevant information that enables your leaders, your executives to perform near real time risk management. Maintaining risk assessments also reduces future assessment costs and supports ongoing risk monitoring efforts. Organizations may determine that conducting comprehensive risk assessments as a way of maintaining current risk assessments does not provide sufficient value. So there are two other types of risk assessments to consider. One is the incremental risk assessment, and the other is a differential risk assessment. That's incremental risk assessment and differential risk assessment. Okay, an incremental risk assessment considers only new information. For example, the effects of using a new information system on risk. A differential risk assessment considers how changes affect the overall risk determination. So, as courses of action are developed in the risk response step, a differential risk assessment may be needed to evaluate differences that each course of action makes in the overall risk determination. Because remember, your risk assessment is going to give you a determination of risk. Well, as you implement controls and as you do things to lock down your systems, or as other things happen in the environment, that risk assessment is going to change. And so a differential risk assessment is going to look at the overall risk determination. Incremental or differential risk assessments are useful if your organization requires a more targeted view of risk, or seek an expanded understanding of risk, or want an expanded understanding of the risk in relation to mission business functions. So keep that in mind. You're maintaining your risk assessments, and you don't have to do the full blown assessment. You can just look at what has happened since the last assessment and determine how that may affect the risk posture. All right, next up, inputs and preconditions to the risk assessment step. These are the inputs and preconditions that come from step 1, risk framing. You get your acceptable risk assessment methodologies. Again, that's whether we're going to do quantitative or qualitative, what methods are we using, breadth and depth of analysis employed doing your risk assessments. I mean, How granular are we going to get? What is the level of rigor that we're going to apply to our risk assessments? The level of granularity required for describing threats, whether and how to assess your external service providers, and whether and how to aggregate risk assessment results from different parts of the organization or mission business functions to the organization as a whole. So, how do I take each risk assessment that happens at each business in each business unit and turn that into an organization wide risk assessment if, in fact, we're doing it that way? So those are your inputs that come from risk framing. And those inputs will establish the preconditions and the constraints around your risk assessment activities. Organizational expectations regarding risk assessments, methods, techniques, and/or procedures are shaped heavily by the governance structure in your organization, your risk tolerance, your culture, trust, and your life cycle processes. Prior to conducting risk assessments, your organization needs to understand the fundamental reason for conducting the assessments. Why are we doing a risk assessment at all? What constitutes adequate depth and breadth of the assessment? Risk assumptions, constraints, risk tolerance, and priorities trade offs, all the stuff that came from the risk framing step, all shape how the organization will use risk assessments. For example, localized applications of the risk assessments within each of the risk management tiers or global applications of the risk assessments across the entire organization. Risk assessments can be conducted even when some of the inputs from the risk framing step have not been received or preconditions established. However, that will impact the quality of the risk assessment results. In addition to the risk framing step, the risk assessment step can receive inputs from the risk response step. For example, when your business is considering the risk of employing new technology based solutions as alternatives for risk reduction measures. As courses of action are developed in the risk response step, a differential risk assessment may be needed to evaluate differences that each course of action makes in the overall risk determination. In addition to the risk framing and risk response steps, the risk assessment step can receive inputs from the risk monitoring step. And again, these are steps in the risk management process, especially during the operations and maintenance phase of the system development lifecycle. For example, when organizations discover new threats or vulnerabilities that require an immediate reassessment of risk. Okay, next up, we're looking at the risk assessment activities. There are two, and even though there are only two activities, this can be a pretty massive undertaking depending on the size of your organization. First, you're going to look at threat and vulnerability identification, and then you're going to do a risk determination. So let's dig into it. Okay, I'm repeating on this slide what a risk assessment is. I'm going to just power past that. There are my two risk assessment tasks. Threat and vulnerability identification. Task 2.1, identify threats to and vulnerabilities in organizational information systems and the environments in which the systems operate. So, threat identification requires an examination of threat sources and threat events. For examining threat sources and events, organizations identify threat capabilities, intentions, and targeting information from available sources. Organizations can leverage a number of sources for threat information at strategic or tactical levels. Threat identification requires an examination of threat sources and threat events. For examining threat sources and events, organizations identify capabilities, intentions, and targeting information from all available sources. Organizations can leverage a number of sources for threat information at strategic or tactical levels. Threat information generated at any tier can be used to inform or to refine the risk-related activities in any other tier. Threats identified during Tier 1 threat assessments may directly affect mission business processes and architectural design decisions at Tier 2. So I'm starting my threat information at tier one. And again, something that I see at tier one at the organization level can cause me to change something at tier two and or tier three. Specific threat information generated at tiers 2 and 3 can be used by organizations to refine threat information generated during initial threat assessments carried out at tier 1. And I guess you get what I'm trying to say is that it happens at all three layers. And what happens at one layer um, almost invariably impacts what happens at the other two layers. Vulnerability identification occurs at all tiers. Vulnerability is related to organizational governance, for example, inconsistent decisions about the priorities of business processes, selection of incompatible implementations of security controls are most effectively identified at tier one. So any organizational governance vulnerabilities are identified at tier one. If you just don't have the governance structure in place, you don't have stuff right there. That's a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities related to external dependencies. That's your electrical power, the supply chain risk, telecommunications are also most effectively identified at tier one because tier one, again, is the organization level. And from that level, we're not just looking at the organization, we're also looking outside at the environment of that the business or the organization is operating in. And we're looking at vulnerabilities and threats that are coming to the organization from outside. However, most of the vulnerability identification is going to occur at tiers 2 and 3. So if it's related to governance or external dependencies, then that's probably going to happen at tier 1. But most of your vulnerability identification is going to occur at the business mission level or at the system level, tiers 2 and 3. At tier two, process and architecture related vulnerabilities are more likely to be identified. Exploitable weaknesses or deficiencies in mission business processes, enterprise information security architectures, including embedded information security architectures. At tier three, information system vulnerabilities are the primary focus. So let me say that again. At tier two, the mission business process level, vulnerabilities related to process and architecture are more likely to be identified. At tier three, your system level, information system vulnerabilities are going to be the primary focus. And these vulnerabilities are commonly found in the hardware, software, and firmware components of your information systems or in the environments in which the systems operate. Other areas of potential vulnerabilities include vulnerabilities associated with the definition, application implementation, and monitoring of processes, procedures, and services related to management, operational, and technical aspects of information security. Vulnerabilities that are associated with architectural design and business processes can have a greater impact on the ability of organizations to successfully carry out their mission due to the potential impact across multiple information systems and mission environments. The refined vulnerability assessments that are conducted at tiers 2 and 3 are shared with organizational personnel responsible for assessing risk more strategically. Vulnerability assessments conducted at tier 2 and tier 3 have the opportunity to evaluate additional related variables such as your location, proximity to other high risk assets, whether that's physical or logical, and resource considerations related to operational environments. So, vulnerabilities that are specific to operational environments. Information specific to operational environments allows for more useful and actionable assessment results. Vulnerability identification can be accomplished at a per individual weakness, deficiency level, or at a root cause level. When selecting between approaches, your organization considers whether the overall objective is identifying each specific instance or symptom of a problem, or whether the objective is understanding the underlying root cause of problems. Understanding specific exploitable weaknesses or deficiencies is helpful when problems are first identified or when quick fixes are required. This specific understanding also provides your organization with necessary sources of information for eventually diagnosing potential root causes of problems, especially those problems that are systemic in nature. Establish enterprise architectures and mature lifecycle processes. For organizations with more established enterprise architectures that include embedded information security architectures and mature lifecycle processes, have outputs that can be used to inform risk assessment processes. Risk assumptions, constraints, tolerances, priorities, and trade offs used for developing enterprise architectures and embedded information security architectures can be useful sources of information for initial risk assessment activities. Risk assessments conducted to support the development of segment or solution architectures may also serve as information sources for the identification of threats and vulnerabilities. And I hope what you're getting here is that by the time you're done with a risk assessment, or at least a really good risk assessment, the people who are doing those assessments have a really good understanding of the information systems, the data, and the enterprise architecture within the organization. So when you come out of this process, you really have an understanding that goes beyond just bolting on different fixes. So the impact of the organizational culture. Another factor influencing threat and vulnerability identification is culture. Organizations that promote free and open communications and non retribution for sharing negative information tend to foster a greater openness from individuals working within those organizations. Frequently, personnel operating at tiers 2 and 3 have valuable information and can make meaningful contributions in the area of threat and vulnerability identification. The culture of organizations will influence the willingness of personnel to communicate potential threat and vulnerability information, which ultimately affects the quality and quantity of threats and vulnerabilities identified. So, if your organization punishes people for telling the truth and putting things on the table, then you're gonna miss some threat and vulnerability information just because people may be afraid to talk about the things within your organization that makes you vulnerable to attack. All right, next up, risk determination. That's task 2 in the risk assessment process. Task 2 says determine the risk to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation if identified threats exploit identified vulnerabilities. Say that again. Determine the risk to your organization, individuals, other organizations, and the nation if identified threats exploit identified vulnerabilities. What if something bad happens? All right, supplemental guidance on risk determination. Organizations determine risk by considering the likelihood that known threats exploit known vulnerabilities and the resulting negative impacts if such exploitation occurs. What is the magnitude of harm if something bad does happen? Organizations use threat and vulnerability information together with likelihood and impact information to determine risk either qualitatively or quantitatively. Organizations can employ a variety of approaches to determine the likelihood of threats exploiting vulnerabilities. Likelihood determinations can be based on either threat assumptions or actual threat information. For example, historical data on cyber attacks, historical data on earthquakes, or specific information on adversary capabilities, intentions, and targeting. When specific and credible threat information is available, organizations can use empirical data and statistical analysis to determine more specific probabilities of threats occurring. Assessment of likelihood can also be influenced by whether vulnerability identification occurred at the individual weakness level or at the root cause level, the relative ease, difficulty of vulnerability exploitation. How hard is it? The sophistication of adversaries. Are we looking at a script kiddie, somebody who's just running a script they saw online, or are we being targeted by some hackers with a lot of funding and time and resources to really get into our systems and cause harm. Assessments of likelihood can also be influenced by the nature of the environment that you're operating in. For impacts, as it relates to risk determination, your organization can characterize adverse impacts by the security objective. For example, loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability. However, to maximize usefulness, adverse impact is expressed in or translated into terms of your organization missions, business functions, and stakeholders. Okay, the risk determination and uncertainty. Risk determinations require analysis of threat, vulnerability, impact, and likelihood information. Organizations also need to examine the mission business vulnerabilities and threats where safeguards and or countermeasures don't exist. The nature of the inputs provided to this step, for example, whether it's general, specific, strategic, tactical, directly affects the types of outputs or risk determinations that are made. The reliability and accuracy of risk determinations are dependent on the currency, accuracy, completeness, and integrity of information collected to support the risk assessment process. Garbage in, garbage out. The components of risk assessment results that affect reliability and the accuracy of risk determinations also affect the amount of uncertainty associated with those risk determinations and any subsequent determinations. So organizations will also consider additional insights related to the anticipated timeframes associated with particular risks. Time horizons associated with potential threats can shape future risk responses. For example, risk may not be a concern if the time horizon for the risk is in the distant future. Still talking about risk determination and uncertainty, organizational guidance for determining risk under uncertainty indicates how combinations of likelihood of and impact are combined into a determination of the risk level or the risk score or rating. Organizations need to understand the type and amount of uncertainty that surrounds risk decisions so that risk determinations can be fully understood. During the risk framing step, organizations may have provided guidance on how to analyze risk and how to determine risk when a high degree of uncertainty exists. Uncertainty is particularly a concern when the risk assessment considers advanced persistent threats for which analysis of interacting vulnerabilities may be needed, the common body of knowledge is sparse, and past behavior may not be predictive. While threat and vulnerability determinations apply frequently to missions and business functions, the specific requirements associated with the mission business functions, including the environments of operation, may lead to different assessment results. We're still talking about risk determination and uncertainty. Different missions, business functions, and environments of operation can lead to differences in the applicability of specific threat information considered and in the likelihood of threats causing potential harm. Understanding the threat component of the risk assessment requires insight into the particular threats facing specific missions or business functions. Such awareness of threats includes understanding the capability, intent, and targeting of particular adversaries. The risk tolerance of organizations and underlying beliefs associated with how the risk tolerance is formed, including the culture within organizations, may shape the perception of impact and likelihood in the context of identified threats and vulnerabilities. Even with the establishment of explicit criteria, risk assessments are influenced by organizational culture and organization culture and the personal experiences and accumulated knowledge of the individuals conducting the risk assessments. As a result, assessors of risk can reach very different conclusions from the same information. Still talking about uncertainty. The diversity of perspective can enrich the risk assessment process and provide decision makers with a greater array of information and potentially fewer biases. However, such diversity may also lead to risk assessments that are inconsistent. Organizationally defined and applied processes provide the means to identify inconsistent practices and to include processes to identify and resolve such inconsistencies. Finally, in as it relates to risk assessments, we're going to look at the outputs and post conditions. So all of that wording and all of that work, what do we get? The output of the risk assessment step is a determination of risk. Depending on the approach that organizations take, either the overall risk to the organization or the inputs used to determine risk may be communicated to the decision makers responsible for risk response. And again, the output of the risk assessment step is a determination of risk to organizational operations, assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. In certain situations, there are recurring cycles between the risk assessment step and the risk response step until particular objectives are achieved. Based on the course of action selected during the risk response step, some residual risk may remain. Under certain circumstances, the level of residual risk could trigger a reassessment of risk. This reassessment is typically incremental, assessing only the newer information. And remember, we have incremental risk assessments and differential risk assessments. The reassessment is typically incremental, assessing only the new information, and differential, assessing how the new information changes the overall risk determination. The aggregation of risk assessment results from all three tiers drives the management of portfolios of risk undertaken by the organization. Identified risk common to more than one business function within organizations may also be the source for future risk assessment activities at tier one, such as root cause analysis. Gaining a better understanding of the reasons why certain risks are more common or more frequent assists decision makers in selecting risk responses that address those particular risks. The results of risk assessments can also shape future design and development decisions related to the enterprise architecture and organizational information systems. The extent to which mission business functions are vulnerable to a set of identified threats and the relative ease with which those vulnerabilities can be exploited contribute to the risk related information provided to senior. Outputs from the risk assessment step can be useful inputs to the risk framing and to the risk monitoring steps. For example, risk determinations can result in revisiting the organization's risk tolerance established during the risk framing step. Organizations can also choose to use information from the risk assessment step to inform the risk monitoring step. For example, risk assessments can include recommendations to monitor specific elements of risk, for example, threat sources, so that if certain thresholds are crossed, previous risk assessment results can be reviewed and updated as appropriate. Particular thresholds established as part of risk monitoring programs can also serve as the basis for reassessments of risk. If organizations establish criteria as a part of the risk framing step for when risk assessment results do not warrant risk responses, then assessment results could be fed directly to the risk monitoring step as a source of input. And so that wraps up the risk framing step of the risk management process. We covered an overview of the process. We talked about risk assessments. We defined what they are, inputs and preconditions, risk assessment activities, and the outputs and post conditions. I really appreciate you guys joining me. I look forward to seeing you again when we talk about step three, risk response. Thanks for your time and have a great day.